What is the most important thing you want me to know about Quaker values?
I think the number one thing I would want people to know about Quaker values is the principle that there is the spark of the divine in everyone. And I think our values and our principles all flow from that.
I would take it then a little bit further and say what that means then to someone who has maybe heard the videos or is listening to us. How do they use that? I think that gets back to the concept of deep listening. Listening very thoughtfully and carefully to each individual, recognizing that, believing that they have that spark of the divine within them, and then taking the time, the opportunity to really hear what they had to say.
What does it mean to trust the process?
The Quaker process is or trusting the process means that taking the time, being deliberate, being thoughtful about how we are going to accomplish this task is a critical, if not the most critical part of accomplishing the task. Trust the fact that a well-defined process can be a huge benefit in accomplishing the task you're trying to do in a timely and a thoughtful and an effective way.
I think also that there's often the idea that Quaker process or Quaker decision-making process takes so long. But it is done well. It's really about trading time. We put the time into hearing from all the different groups, hearing from people who will be impacted, and building that sense of community as we move towards making a decision, instead of making a decision without that input and then having to deal with the impact after.
So in other words, that by taking the time to think through the process, hopefully that the implementation of the task can be accomplished that much more efficiently because everyone has bought into, or at least has been heard and understood the facts and the elements that went into the decision.
Right.
What does it mean to hold someone in the light?
So I think of that expression as really consistent with the notion of I will pray for you. I think of it as the divine shining their light of love and goodness onto a person, and thinking of them, holding them in the spirit is what holding in the light means to me.
I like that. I like that.
Who leads a Quaker meeting?
I think if we were talking to a group of Quakers in a meeting, they would say it's led by the Spirit. But in terms of sort of the practical way that meetings are run, they're run by volunteer committees. There are no paid clergy. There's no minister. And so that the community works by a series of committees: Worship and Ministry Committee, an Oversight and Pastoral Care Committee, Finance Committee, like many traditional churches. Also, there is a person that's named to be the clerk of the meeting, and that is the individual that then runs the monthly business meeting, set the agenda, and runs the business meeting. And Quakers typically call that individual the clerk, because that individual is clerking the process, is moving the process forward, is not necessarily the person that has all the information, let alone the right calling or direction that we're going to go.
So when we think about leading the worship service, it's important to think about which way of practicing the faith you are referring to. So in the unprogrammed Friends tradition, someone in the meeting will be appointed to sit head of meeting for that particular Sunday meeting for worship. And so when they settle into silence, it's kind of a sign for everyone to. And then they signify the end of the meeting for worship period by shaking hands with someone next to them. In the semi-program Friends or evangelical Friends tradition, there are Quaker pastors who lead the service.
We talk about sometimes in unprogrammed meetings about sitting on the facing bench.
Yes.
And that is the practice sometimes of people who are responsible for that particular meeting will sit on the facing bench and, as Jane said, begin meeting and shake hands when it's over. There was a term when I was growing up called weighty friends, meaning the weighty friends would sit on the facing bench. These were friends, tends to be our grandparents, that were the people that were seasoned and had a lot of experience as Quakers, often would speak in meeting. They tended to sit up in front on the facing benches in the meeting that I recall.
What does it mean to season a decision?
Well, I was going to say, I think seasoning a decision simply means that we're going to spend some time with it. We're going to spend some time as a group getting comfortable with it, be sure we all understand the issue from particular aspects, be sure that we've heard what other individuals' perspective is on that particular issue, and so that we give the community an opportunity to season with it. It's sort of relaxing and really studying and understanding that issue for the benefit of all involved.
Are Quakers Christian?
Quakerism is a very individual religion, a very individual faith about your lived faith and your lived connection to the divine. My experience has been that some Quakers consider themselves Christians and some don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine would be that most Quakers consider themselves Christian and clearly use the Bible not as the Word of God, but more as an exceedingly valuable perspective of the way we should live our lives. I think that, as Jane said, there's many different dimensions of that, many different perspectives, but certainly when George Fox and Margaret Fell and others started Quakerism, it was started as a new Christian religion. And most Friends, I think, would consider themselves Christian today, but Jane's right, there may be some that don't.
Do Quakers baptize their children?
I can speak about that from the unprogrammed tradition, which is a tradition that I grew up with, is that Quakers do not typically baptize their children in this outward baptism. Rather, we talk about children and individuals being baptized by the Spirit. In other words, influenced by the Spirit, and then living our life in a way that's consistent with that connection with the Spirit.
Why do you take a moment of silence?
When we start a meeting or a gathering with a moment of silence, the idea is that it gives you an opportunity to clear your mind of all the different things that are going through your head at that point, and to be able to focus on the task at hand, to open your mind to hearing the thoughts and perspectives of others, to deep listening to all that's going wrong in that meeting, all that's going around, so that we are able to think about things as a community, as a whole. Sometimes silence may also be used in a meeting if things start to get a little bit heated, a little bit emotional. The facilitator may say, why don't we take a moment or two of silence here and just settle back and remember what it is we're doing. And then often meetings will be closed with a moment of silence as an opportunity to relax, reflect, and appreciate what you've been part of.
Provide thanks for what we've been doing in the group that's gathered here.
Yeah.
Are Quakers political?
Some Quakers are very political. There's a long history of Quakers being involved in social activism, in issues around women's rights, abolition, education, prison reform.
Gun control. Right.
Yeah. So, but they can also be very quiet. So it really, again, it's an individual faith and it's an individual choice whether they are outwardly involved in politics.
How do Quakers feel about serving in the military?
Most Quakers are pacifists, and many register as conscientious objectors. Not all, but many do. Some feel it's their responsibility and right to join the military service, but most become conscientious objectors. In fact, Quakers were involved in helping the whole idea of conscientious objectors be something that's accepted by the government right now. And there are many people who live in our communities who were conscientious objectors during the Second World War and spent their time in alternative service, whether that was in a mental hospital or some other way that they were serving the country, but not in the military. And still, so they were being true to their beliefs.
For those friends who do choose to join the military, then it's not that they are banished from the faith, that there is a recognition that that is what they feel that they need to do. And so we hold them in the light, pray for them, for their safety, and recognize that that was an individual choice.
Are Quakers Amish?
No, Quakers are not Amish.
No, they come out of very different traditions. The Amish come out of the German tradition, and Quakers out of the English tradition of George Fox in the mid-1600s.
Are Quakers and Puritans the same thing?
No, they're not. Quakers and Puritans come out of different religious traditions.
Do Quakers celebrate birthdays?
Yes, and again, it's very individual how it's done. Some Quakers may celebrate birthdays in more elaborate fashion than others, but it is recognized, I think, as a general practice that we celebrate birthdays.
Why use the thee, thou, and how do you use it?
Yes, the use of thee and thou has to do with in the way that formal and informal language was used in England back in the 1600s and early 1700s. And thee and thou were an informal way of addressing people. So when Quakers would address an individual, they would always say, how does thee feel about this particular issue? What is thou's opinion of this? And in doing so, what they were trying to do was not distinguish in terms of the language that was used between the common man and royalty. And there were differences in the way that was done in Old English. I remember when I was growing up, my father would talk to his parents' contemporaries, in other words, my grandparents' contemporaries, using thee and thou. It has turned out to be something that's rarely used in the communities that I'm involved with right now, but it is something I remember being used.
That was the language that was used in our household. My siblings, my parents. There's a joke from college. I have a twin sister, and we ended up at the same college, not by design, it just happened, and actually lived together the last semester of our senior years. And that was the time in colleges when you didn't have cell phones. And so our appointed time that we talked to our parents was 2 o'clock every Sunday. And the joke was, if on our hall, our group of friends, if you didn't have anything to do on Sunday at 2, we'll go listen to the twins speak Quaker.
How do Quakers worship?
That will depend on the tradition, the practice of which Quaker you're talking about. So unprogrammed friends, we worship in silence and expectant listening. Semi-programmed friends will have a Quaker pastor who will lead part of the worship service, and then there is usually also a period of silent worship. And then evangelical friends have a Quaker pastor who will lead the full service, much more consistent with what you would see in other Christian churches.
It's interesting because it's like many denominations, Quakerism over time has split up into following different leaders in different parts of the country. And as Jane said, so then now there are different branches of Quakerism that really if you were to walk into a Quaker meeting or a Quaker church, it could feel very different. And it's interesting how the denomination has evolved that way.
Are there many Quakers?
There's about, in the United States, there's about 75,000 Quakers of all the denominations, as I understand it. But there's more Quakers in East Africa than there are in the United States, because there was a very significant opportunity and effort to attract people in Eastern Africa to Quakerism, and it's been very successful.
Yeah, the fastest growing areas of Quakerism in the world are Africa and then South America, very South America, and it's the evangelical Friends traditions where they are growing.
More so than the unprogrammed traditions that you and I grew up in. It's the evangelical traditions that have been successful in really growing their denomination.
What does it mean to be under the care of?
Well, that's interesting because that's a term or a phrase that we use in a couple different ways. We sometimes have a marriage that's under the care of a meeting, which fundamentally means that the meeting will take responsibility, is taking responsibility for not only that wedding, but that couple going forward. Taking responsibility and staying connected with them, being available to them, moving forward. And it's the same for sometimes there'll be a preparative meeting under the care of an established meeting. Sometimes there'll be a friend's school under the care of a monthly meeting. And it's important that if you're involved in something like that, you understand exactly what the nuances of that relationship are, but it can mean something as formal as the monthly meeting ultimately is responsible for that school. And it's important to understand if that is the case. So it's a bit of a term that has a variety of definition and shades of definition, but it's used in quite commonly in Quaker language and in Quaker circles.
What do Quakers wear?
In the past, Quakers may have worn very plain clothes, black and white, in some ways consistent with what we think of as the Amish today. But in the modern world, Quakers can wear whatever they want.
Right, I think that's right. And I was reading something not long ago about Lucretia Mott, where she said that, please don't pay attention to what I'm wearing, pay attention to my deeds. That's where my faith lies. My faith lies in my deeds, not in what I wear.
I like that.
Do kids go to meetings?
My experience growing up is yes, both as a child and then when my husband and I had children. They are not usually present for the entire meeting for worship. Depending on the practices of the individual meeting, it may be at the beginning, it may be at the end. But yes, typically they will participate in some portion of the meeting for worship, and then they leave that, or they come from that and they're at Sunday school.
Sometimes, if it's a small meeting, there is no Sunday school, and other times if there are a few children, Sunday school would be such that there'll be combined classes, so that every child from pre-kindergarten to third grade might be in one class, and then up to 8th grade in another class. So they do some team teaching like that. But it really depends on the number of families that there are in a meeting. I've been in meetings that have had a Sunday school for a period of time, and then as the number of children is reduced, there's no Sunday school going on. And so, but many and most meetings do have a Sunday school and have some then element of the children participating in meeting for worship.
That's actually how David and I met, was the meeting where my husband and I belonged when our children were young. The number of families diminished, so there was not a very active Sunday school program. So we looked around at other meetings, went to visit other meetings, and ultimately joined the meeting where David and his family worshiped.